Welcome to Sagely Speaking with Mary Bono, the esteemed former Congresswoman known for her insightful perspectives and vast experience. Prepare to be engaged in thought-provoking conversations with influential personalities, exploring a wide range of topics, from social issues, politics, and policy, to personal development, shedding light on important issues that impact our society. Now, here's Mary.
Welcome to Sagely Speaking, where we delve into the realms of insight and inspiration. I'm your host, Mary Bono, and before we dive in, I'd like to extend a heartfelt thank you to our sponsors who make this podcast possible. A big shout out to Mothers Against Prescription Drug Abuse, or MAPDA, who is driving solutions to prevent drug abuse and overdose deaths by focusing on prevention through education and awareness. And our other sponsor is Zomad, who is connecting brands with influential voices around the globe. So thank you again to our sponsors. And now let's get started with today's guest, who I am extremely excited to have on. Captain Christopher M. Jones currently serves as director of the Center for Substance Abuse Prevention, or CSAP, at the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. Captain Jones brings a wealth of experience to SAMHSA, having led substance use, mental health, and injury and violence prevention policy, program, and research activities for more than a decade. And I can say I've worked with Captain Jones, who I'm going to call Chris throughout this interview, because I don't know, you just feel like a friend to me. So I'm going to call him Chris. And I'm so excited because I have worked with him and I've heard him talk, and his passion for drug abuse prevention, which I believe has been overlooked for far too long. So welcome, Chris. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much. Really glad to be with you today.
Chris, how is SAMHSA viewing prevention as a part of the larger strategy in protecting Americans from drug abuse and overdose deaths?
Well, I think that, SAMHSA released its strategic plan last fall, which really does place prevention as a foundational piece of the overall approach to addressing substance use and overdose. And I think behavioral health and well-being more generally. And as you noted at the top, I think prevention has been that thing that's sort of been waiting for its moment. As we have been focusing on treatment and naloxone and overdose prevention necessarily, given the magnitude of the overdose crisis, really it is time for a focus on prevention. And I think if you look at the preventing substance use and overdose priority of the strategic plan, or supporting children, youth, and families, prevention is right there in the mix as really that long-run strategy for how we get ahead of the substance use and mental health challenges that we're facing in our country. So as I've stepped into this role, I've really embraced that it is our moment in prevention. I think this is what people are hungry for, is to think about how do we help those communities who are struggling across the country, who have seen, 2 decades worth of increases in overdose deaths, families torn apart. We have prevention science on our side to say, we don't have to keep doing this. We can get upstream and get ahead of these challenges.
Chris, is it because of fentanyl that suddenly people are focusing more on prevention when one pill can kill, and kids no longer have time, the time to, or I don't know what the word would be. They don't have the opportunity to screw up as much as we did when we were kids. We used to get away with a lot, and now you can't. So is fentanyl the driver in this change?
I think fentanyl certainly underscores the urgency of the situation, and I think it does challenge our efforts to think these are novel and unique challenges, and that they require novel and unique solutions. As I've gone around and talked to folks about the changing epidemiology of drug use and overdose and the dynamics that are playing out, I always say that drug use is riskier than it's ever been. Whether it's your first time using a substance or somebody that has a longstanding substance use disorder, your risk of overdose has never been higher. And that is very much driven by fentanyl, illicit synthetic opioids that are showing up in counterfeit pills that are being mixed in with cocaine or methamphetamine. It's just that real proliferation and unpredictability of fentanyl in the drug market that I think has raised the urgency of the situation. But we've also been seeing that overdose deaths among young people in particular have been going up over the last several years. So it's really hitting people very close to home. And as you said, it used to be that somebody might, initiate with substances and not experience harms necessarily right away. But now somebody gives you Xanax, an anti-anxiety pill, or something that looks like Vicodin or hydrocodone. And in most cases, it's not what you think it is. In fact, it's fentanyl. And so you see these young people who don't have long histories with drug use who are dying from overdose. And I think that is raising the urgency among policymakers, among people in communities, that we've got to do more, and prevention has got to be a part of that solution.
We hear so often that the so-called war on drugs failed, and that Just Say No was another failure, and that these campaigns never worked, and that they actually backfired. But since these campaigns have been abandoned, the statistics are undeniably much, much worse. Where do we go from here?
Well, I think the good news is that we do have decades of prevention science that show what works in prevention. And that is really how we're approaching our work at SAMHSA, is to look at the risk and protective factors at the individual level, at the family level, at the community and school level, drawing from that science and that community experience for what works. And so we do know when it comes to communication campaigns that if it's just a communication campaign and it's not done in tandem with other changes that are happening in the community, it's not likely to have an impact. And so we do have to look at this holistically. How are we helping parents communicate with kids about the dangers of substances? How are we helping kids to develop healthy relationships, to deal with problems, conflict resolution, the normal challenges that come with growing up? By focusing on those things, and that can be done through programs, through policies, through communication campaigns that can all mutually reinforce each other, we can have an impact. And I think one statistic that is often missed, because we are, typically focusing on rises in overdose deaths, but if you actually look at youth substance use across multiple government surveys, substance use among young people, 12 to 17-year-olds, high school students, is actually down to historically low levels in recent years. And that cuts across pretty much all substances. And I don't think we celebrate that enough. So we are making progress in that area, but we still have a lot of work to do. And it does take that holistic approach to have the impact that we want to have. And just one campaign that I'll talk about is the Talk They Hear You campaign, which is a campaign that comes out of CSAP at SAMHSA. But the idea here is that parents, teachers, school administrators, others, they want to have a conversation with kids about substance use, but they don't necessarily always have the right things to say or know what to say. And sometimes there's a fear that if you have that conversation, that somehow you're going to impress upon a kid the idea of using substances. But this campaign has really been tailored to help jumpstart those conversations with parents, with other adult role models for kids, to help navigate them that, one, it's okay and it's important for you to have those conversations with kids, with youth, in your community, but here are some strategies for how you might have those conversations. So I don't think that we should throw campaigns out completely. They're really important, especially in making sure that adults and parents have the tools that they need to have conversations with kids. But we need to do that in tandem with other changes that are addressing other risk and protective factors.
I'm so happy to hear you talk about this. As you know, I run a little organization, Mothers Against Prescription Drug Abuse, and we have a campaign. We showed it to you and your team called The Greatest Gift is a Conversation. So I think we're on the same wavelength here. But what I learned was so many parents think this is not going to happen to me. And this is a hurdle we need to get over, to have parents understand this is happening to everybody and that nobody is immune. So how do we get parents to recognize this is an important conversation? And so, this came to me from a conversation I was having with a young mother who was sending her daughter off to her freshman year at college. And when I said, "Have you had the talk?" And when I was a kid, the talk was about something else. But now this talk being about the drug supply and the dangers. And the mother's response was, "I don't need to. My kid is a good kid." And it was a lost opportunity, I thought, that people need to realize? Is SAMHSA's effort, are you getting through to parents, or are they kind of stonewalling this?
I would say I think there's, variation across all parents, but we are trying to provide tools and resources to communities to jumpstart those conversations, to really make it part of the norms in a community that we have these conversations, because the impacts are not happening on the margins, that they are happening across socioeconomic status. Good kids, bad kids, however you want to refer to it, it really can happen to anybody in a community. And we need to be having conversations about strategies to reduce your risk. How do we give kids the skills to resist peer pressure, to, again, work through problems and conflict resolution, handling emotions. And I think about this in my own life as a young person. I'm a person in long-term recovery. I've shared that many times. I really had never used substances in my life. I had my wisdom teeth taken out. I was prescribed opioids, and that was off to the races for me. And that was sort of my trajectory into drug use. But prior to that, never a conversation with my parents. And, it was just the norm to not talk about that, right? I had good grades. I played sports. I was active in other activities going on in my life. And on all outward appearances, I would not have been someone considered at risk. But, that was the event for me. So I see it now as a parent. I have an almost 11-year-old. I'm having those conversations now, not necessarily about methamphetamine or fentanyl, but age-appropriate conversations to, one, just have that door open. We're building trust. I'm asking her about her day. I'm, helping her navigate challenges that are playing out with her friends as they're getting into adolescence, so that when the time comes, we're not starting from zero and being able to have a difficult or challenging conversation. But, I didn't get the handbook for parents, right, on how to have those conversations and what is age appropriate. And that's why the campaigns like Talk They Hear You are intended to provide those resources for parents, so that you're not in that moment saying, you know what, I wish I had had that conversation before the kid goes off to college and is in a totally different environment where they're introduced to different types of risks. So I think the communication piece is just so foundational for parents, for coaches, for others who may interact with young people, just to have that open dialogue so that kids can talk about their struggles and that there's trust there, and that, whatever you bring to them, you're going to be there, empathetic, compassionate, hear them, and try to help with the struggles that they're facing.
If I might comment on your recovery and say, I consider you a role model for many, that recovery works. And I'm so, I don't know if proud of you is the right word, or if that sounds condescending, but I am. And as you know, I struggle. My family's had struggles with people who are in long-term recovery, but it took a while to get there. But thank you for being who you are and honest and open about it. But, conversations with our kids are great. And I think it's the number one thing we can do right now. But as you know, there's so much talk going on about the borders. Are we doing enough at the southern border to stop the flow of fentanyl coming in from Mexico and in China and the threat that exists there? Parents are begging for help beyond conversations. Are we doing enough there internationally to stem the flow of fentanyl?
Well, I certainly would defer those types of issues to our counterparts in government who are dealing with interdiction and supply reduction. But I often use those opportunities to say it really underscores why the prevention piece is so important, that there is a demand for substances in the U.S., and that if we can prevent initiation of substance use, drive down demand, we can impact the public health outcomes, the mortality, the overdose, all the other social and health harms that come along with substance use. So those, supply and interdiction activities have to happen in tandem with the demand reduction activities. And that's what we're focused on, certainly at SAMHSA and the Prevention Center, is really looking at those upstream root causes of substance use and thinking about how are we promoting wellness and well-being, and how are we reducing demand for substances in the first place. But again, it's a comprehensive whole of government approach that is needed.
You're right. again, you speak and it's music to my ears. But again, parents are not only the border, but their kids are being targeted by dealers on social media. And as you know, there's a big effort now. People there's a bill in Congress championed by Buddy Carter and Debbie Wasserman Schultz on social media responsibility, giving parents tools. But even if they do, there's still these risks. And this is why the conversations are so critical and so important. And again, to recognize this is the reality now. And so we want to help you get the word out about what you're doing, and hopefully you can help us get our word out, and hopefully they complement one another. I believe that they do. But I think last week, an important study, a RAND study, was released. It said more than 40% of Americans know someone who has died of a drug overdose, and about a third of those individuals say their lives were disrupted by that death. And if we look at those numbers a little bit differently, I think it drives the point home a little bit better. But 2 in 5 Americans know somebody who fatally overdosed. 2 in 5. And 1 in 8 Americans say fatal overdose has disrupted their lives. I know you and I both know a lot of parents who've lost a child to an overdose death. And I know that's what drives you to do what you do and why I do what I do. It's a passion. Too many parents suffer, but they suffer silently. We've never really looked at the collateral damage that these overdose deaths take. I'm sure you've seen this study, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts you'd want to share about that information.
Yeah, I mean, I think as you indicated, it really underscores sort of the universality of the substance use crisis that we're facing in our country, that it has touched all aspects of communities. And it, I think, underscores that the harms of substance use don't stop with the individual who's using substances, but they have rippling consequences and impacts throughout families, throughout communities. I think this is, the RAND study is one of a long line of research that has documented, that many people know somebody who's struggled with substance use or substance use disorder. And this is now sort of another dimension talking about people who've died from an overdose. One of the slides that I often present when I'm talking about substance use and overdose is the rate of death among different age groups. And when we look at, say, like 18 to 24-year-olds, 18 to 25-year-olds, it's about 1 in 5 deaths are due to drug overdose. Out of all the reasons that somebody in that age group dies, 1 in 5 is an overdose. When you look at, 26 to 34-year-olds, it's about 1 in 3. Even among 12 to 17-year-olds, it's about 1 in 11, 1 in 12 deaths. So again, this is an issue that is playing out in communities across our country. And I think while it is absolutely tragic, and we should do all that we can to raise awareness about, the changing epidemiology and toxicity of the illicit drug market, we also have to think about how are we helping to support the families who have lost loved ones. And as you indicated, I agree. I think it is an area that has had less focus. One of the areas when we think about prevention is sort of the multi-generational impacts, because we also know that many kids have lost parents to overdose. So how do we think about bereavement? How do we think about, kinship care? How are we supporting those young people to develop healthy relationships when traumatic events have happened in their life? And that's a component of our work in prevention, is looking at things like adverse childhood experiences. And we know that, death of a loved one due to overdose or suicide is an adverse childhood experience. But we also know that helping to connect kids who've had ACEs to other healthy, positive adult role models, to other supports and services, opportunities for connectedness and youth empowerment can also blunt those effects and help people to have greater resilience. And so I think we can also look at that for families and parents who've lost kids to an overdose or young people to an overdose. How are we supporting them? How are we helping to connect them to others who have walked that same path? I mean, again, sort of drawing back to my experience, when I went into treatment, I was 21. And in my community, among my parents' social group, that was unheard of. But once it came out that I was struggling and that I went to treatment, it was almost like the dam broke, and many other parents were able to acknowledge, like, oh, my kid is struggling, or I would talk, they want to talk to me about treatment. And I think it's the same. There's so much stigma and shame that keeps people, in the shadows. And as we think about, over 1 million lives lost from an overdose in the last decade or so, we really have to break through that stigma and shame and just acknowledge that loss has occurred, because out of that acknowledgement, people can begin to heal. People can begin to find others who have navigated those same challenges. But it is a pervasive challenge with stigma and shame. And I know you have also experienced that, but it is people who have walked that path speaking up and making it safe for others to speak up that is going to be a really important part of how we all collectively move forward.
Yeah, I can really relate to your story when you went into treatment. And I remember as a high school student or junior high school student, I finally confided in one of my friends that my mother was an alcoholic. And I felt like I was sort of the Munsters. I was, the dragon under the stairs, lived in I think it was the Munsters. And that was alcoholism back then in my family. And I kept the secret for the longest time. And when I told this girl who was like one of my friends, her name is Kelly, she said, oh my gosh, my mom is too. And that's what it took. And then suddenly all of our friends were having this conversation, but it took somebody breaking the ice. And it's important. My story's 50 years old, and it hasn't changed much, which is so sad. But kind of shifting a little bit right here, you reminded me that we had met years ago on the Hill when I was a member of Congress and you were a young staffer. I don't know who you're working for or what you're doing. What were you doing?
I was at ONDCP on a detail from FDA. It's like 2010.
Okay. Well, you have to admit there's been a seismic shift in Congress from where we were in 2010, where people were denying that there was an opioid crisis, that, how Congressman Hal Rogers and I were working on these issues, and every step we took, people were right behind us, sort of shutting down our efforts. There's been a huge shift. And I credit you and SAMHSA and other advocates for that shift. But I would assume your work feels a little bit easier now than it did in 2010. But Congress is much more receptive. And is there a single member of Congress who isn't trying to do something? And that's a rhetorical question because there probably is, but I can't believe that there would be. But it's got to be a little bit easier on the Hill these days.
Yeah, certainly, since that time, you have seen, you guys were early adopters for like the Prescription Drug Abuse Caucus. Now there are multiple caucuses in both Senate and the House that are looking at various aspects of this issue. I've testified a couple of times in the last few years. I know our SAMHSA Assistant Secretary has also testified. The Support Act has been, being debated in Congress, and that created a number of new programs several years ago, and in CARA before that. And certainly a substantial infusion in resources has come from Congress. So I agree. I think it is much more commonplace to be able to have a conversation about this issue, to have an open dialogue about, rising rates of overdose and who is dying and what do we know works. And so while there's obviously always a need for continued education because it's a dynamic situation, it does seem like there is generally a baseline of understanding that there's not a single solution to this challenge, that we have to focus on prevention and treatment and recovery and harm reduction, in addition to supply and interdiction efforts. So I am grateful that Congress has continued to remain engaged on this issue and that there are more champions who are working to address this issue. We still have much work to do, but we have many more resources to do that work than we did, 15 years ago.
So the SAMHSA budget's good? I'm just catching you with your own words here.
Certainly it has grown. I think that we continue to hear from communities who need additional resources, but we're trying to optimize the resources that we have.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you have the resources. That's always very good to hear. And usually we hear the opposite. But I just want to, again, I could talk to you forever and ever. And I know that we're seeing signs trickle down from the leadership that you all are providing. I'm happy to say that here in my hometown in Colorado, there is a ride-along program where a police officer has a behavioral health expert ride along to many of these phone calls, obviously not for a violent incident, but if it's a behavioral health, somebody who's overdosing, they go forward with more of a compassionate approach than simply the law enforcement approach. And I personally believe that we can criminalize dealers and help users get into treatment, that we can do both. That's sort of my personal philosophy. But I just want to thank you personally for your great work. I mean, every time you speak, it just makes my heart glad to hear that we are focused on the right thing. And is there anything further you'd like to add? You have a website to share about the campaign?
So if you can Google Talk They Hear You, that's the one, again, that's intended for parents and others to have conversations with kids. It has a variety of different tools and resources. We also have something called Screen for Success, which is a short screener that people can do themselves or, parents and kids can do. And it really is just taking stock of how is somebody doing and what level of resources might they need. Because, oftentimes, somebody may say, oh, I need to go to this type of treatment or that type of treatment, but they don't really know what's available or is that really the right thing. And this was a sort of a mental well-being substance use screener that we developed to try to make it easier, but also to help support conversations among parents and kids. So I would say those are two resources that you can easily find. And then, of course, the SAMHSA.gov website has many other resources, whether you're a policymaker working in a community coalition, looking for data on the latest trends for substance use and substance use disorder. We try to make those things as accessible as possible on our website. But really appreciate the time and appreciate the focus on prevention. Like I said, I think our moment is now. This is what's been around the corner, and people are looking to say, what do we need to be doing next? What we need to be doing next is focusing on prevention and getting ahead of the challenges that communities are facing.
Amen. Very well said. Again, we can go on, and hopefully you'll come back for another episode of Sagely Speaking. But I want to, again, thank you, Captain Jones. I hope my listeners have enjoyed our conversation with Captain Chris Jones. Thank you all of my listeners for joining us on today's episode of Sagely Speaking. I want to thank our sponsors again, MAPTA and Zomad, for making this podcast possible. So until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and keep seeking wisdom in all you do.
Thank you for joining us today on Sagely Speaking with Mary Bono. Remember, wisdom is a journey, not a destination. For more insights, visit our website at sagelyspeaking.com.